Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Jones. I'm the Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and I'm thrilled to greet you all and welcome you to Conversations in Black Freedom Studies, Virtual Edition. Thanks for joining us. And thank you to Latia Eli for live captioning tonight's event for the hearing impaired. We'll post instructions for viewing those captions into the chat window now. The Schomburg Center, a world-renowned institution dedicated to archiving, studying, and interpreting the global Black experience, is celebrating its 95th year. We have a lot of virtual and digital offerings in store, such as our Black Liberation Reading List, our virtual Women's Jazz Festival, and much more, all of which you can explore by visiting schomburgcenter.org. The Conversations in Black Freedom Studies series is a space to talk about new works in Black social movement history. It's Women's History Month, and today we're considering two new books in Black women's history. Both of these books invite us to rethink US history more broadly. To guide us in this, we're so fortunate to have three amazing authors. In a moment, we'll introduce Daina Ramey Berry and Callie Nicole Gross, authors of A Black Women's History of the United States, and Jeanne Theoharis, author of The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, Young Readers Edition. If you haven't already, you can purchase both of these books at the Schomburg shop at schomburgshop.com, and copies of The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks will come to you signed by the author. Virtual events, of course, are not the same as gathering in person, but they do create some new opportunities for engagement. For example, when we get to the last portion of our agenda, if you want to ask a question of our speakers, you can click on the Q&A menu item, which for most of you will be near the bottom of your Zoom window, and just type your question into the box that pops up. We're also streaming live to YouTube, and we'll take questions there too. This event is being recorded and will be available for anyone to view after the fact on the Schomburg Center's YouTube page. Now, by default, all of you watching will remain anonymous in that recording. If we read out your question, we'll only mention your first name to preserve your anonymity. This is an important discussion, and I'm quite certain we won't get to every question, but we'll do our best. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll get to them in the last part of tonight's agenda. And now, I'd like to bring on stage Brooklyn College Professor of Political Science, Jeanne Theoharis, who's usually in the role of co-moderator for this series, but tonight, is in the author's chair. Welcome, Jeanne.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for bringing us this online Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. For those of you who've been with us before in the Schomburg, this is actually our 9th season of Conversations. And while it's sad not to be in the building, it is also offers us a chance to be together across the country for people to come who wouldn't necessarily be able to join us in Harlem. So it has its advantages, and we are so grateful to the Schomburg for continuing this in this new form. As Brian mentioned, we started this series 9 years ago. Kamosi Woodard and I started this series 9 years ago, in part because there were fewer and fewer spaces in the city. Bookstores were closing. There were fewer public spaces where we could come together to hear new works in Black history, to learn from people, to listen to new work, but also to get a chance to ask questions and to think through it together, and particularly history that helps us to see the present more clearly. So that was the origins of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. We have done it on the first Thursday of every month since then. We don't do it in the summer, but during the school year. Kamosi is taking a more emeritus role this season, so he's not joining us today. But as Brian was saying, tonight represents something a little bit different for many of you who've been with us before, which is that in a second, I'm going to turn it back to Brian, and he do the Q&A and moderate our conversation tonight, because I'm really excited to be bringing my young adult version of The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks that I co-adapted with Brandy Colbert to the Schomburg audience tonight. And I say this in part because one of the conversations we've been having for these 9 years is, how do we teach this? How do we bring this material into our classrooms? And that conversation has been in my head over the past 9 years, because my original book came out, it was the first conversation we were supposed to do, and we were snowed out. So in many ways, this is a very moving night for me. And I'm so glad to sort of get to be in a different kind of chair. But before I turn it back to Brian, I wanted to introduce to you Daina Ramey Berry is the Oliver H. Radke Regents Professor of History and a chair of the History Department at the University of Texas at Austin. She is also a fellow of Walter Prescott Webb Chair in History and the George W. Littlefield Professorship in American History, and the former Associate Dean of the Graduate School. And Callie Nicole Gross is a professor of African American Studies at Emory University and the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of History at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. She's on leave there. She is also the Creative Productions Director for the Association of Black Women Historians and is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. So welcome and thank you for being with us, and I'll turn it back to you, Brian.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
It's so great to have you all here together. And, for everybody's bio, we could go on and on and on. There's so much more to say. And you should look up their websites and look at their full bios. So to bring our readers and viewers into your books, I'm hoping we can start with a little bit of an origin story, how you got started deciding to write these particular books. And I'd like to start with you, Callie and Daina.
Sure. It's interesting. We actually were approached by an editor at Beacon about the possibility of writing this book because they have a whole series called Revisioning American History. But it was really a fortuitous invitation because we had actually been having this conversation about the need for a newer kind of survey on Black women's history. And so we were really excited at the possibility and also a little bit terrified by the prospect of trying to do a history of Black women that would be able to reach as wide an audience as possible.
And
Daina, do you want to add to that story? Yeah.
Just briefly, we were at the same institution when we first had conversations about writing this book. And then we've gone to different places, but we've been writing this book. It took 7 years. And we finished our own second single authored books before this one came out. So we were kind of double dipping on more than one project at the same time. But it's been a really real pleasure and a great experience for both of us.
And Jeanne, I know this is the young reader edition of a book that you first published a while back. I guess the GrownUp version. But what's the origin of that book and this book? You're muted.
I am. So the origin of the GrownUp book, or the original book, was actually Mrs. Parks's funeral, which happened in October of 2005, and I was riveted, as many of us were. It was an epic honoring, right? She's the first woman to lie in honor in the Capitol. We've only just this year with Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a second woman lying in honor, right? So it's this epic honor, except that even as she was being honored, what was being honored just got smaller and smaller, and she was constantly referred to as quiet and not angry and quiet and humble and quiet and quiet and quiet. And she was trapped on the bus. And it seemed to me that we couldn't divorce why we were having this national funeral for her from the fact that less than 2 months earlier had been Hurricane Katrina. And that had raised some very profound questions of enduring racial inequality. And it seemed like this national funeral for Rosa Parks was a way to put some different images. So the project really started as a project of thinking about public memory and public honoring. And then I discovered that there was no serious footnoted book of Rosa Parks. And it just was astonishing to me, but seemed to fit the argument I was making about kind of the way she was being honored, that somehow she could be one of the most honored Americans of the 20th century, and yet reserved as this kind of hero for children of which we needed to know only one fact or a handful of facts. So that's really where the original book starts. But the young adult book, and the book that I published this month, look how beautiful it is, I'm so excited, is really for kind of 12 and up for high school. And in many ways that starts many, many, many years ago, which is that I began my career as a high school teacher teaching African-American history in a public high school in Boston. And so in some sense, this comes back to my roots as a high school teacher, but also kind of really grappling with, and again, this is a conversation we've had at the Schomburg for many years now, of how to bring this material kind of into the high school curriculum. And what would it mean to get to learn this before college? Because so many of my students and so many of my colleagues and friends who teach the Rosa Parks book say their students feel so cheated, and my students feel so cheated. And, why did I have to wait till college to learn this? And so in many ways, the origin of the young adult book really is out of that question of like, what would it mean not to have to wait to college to learn this, and to get a kind of fuller history of Rosa Parks, but also because she has such a huge political history, a fuller history of the Black freedom struggle in the 20th century.
And all three of you write about the challenge of then when you set yourself the challenge of writing these books, that to actually go out and get the story presented certain challenges. Because if your subject is Black women, well, that's a group of people who stand in a certain relationship to the archive and to the records, and who've often been ignored in the archive or understudied or under-recorded. Or so can you talk a little bit about what you had to do to get these stories? Daina, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. There's a sad story, but an interesting story that happened while we were researching. We were trying to find women from the American Revolution, and we knew that there were Black women that were present, not just those that ran away. We had found a record where an enslaver was trying to get back or reclaim 8 enslaved laborers of his that he allowed to go fight in the war. And we saw somewhere that there was 7 men and 1 woman. So we contacted the archive, and they said, oh, well, that's not correct. And it said this on the descriptive inventory on the website. They said, oh, no, it's just, that was wrong. It's all men. And I said, well, I would like to purchase the document, send it to us so that Dr. Gross and I can take a look at it. And sure enough, when they sent it after 5 or 6 weeks, I think it was a slip of paper, and it said 7 men and 1 woman, and they were all enslaved. So it was like, this was the woman that we were looking for. But even today, and I'm not saying that all archivists are like this, let me be really clear, but there still are gatekeepers that don't want their Black women's stories to be told, or that they didn't like she was important enough for us to wait 6 weeks and us to push and push and push so that we can include her story in the book. So that's just one example of one experience of searching through the archives.
Callie, do you have a story as well?
Yeah, I would definitely just echo what Daina said. It is definitely a challenge. I think the other piece, I'm sorry, Dr. Berry said, the other piece that for me personally was a challenge too, was also really trying to find ways to make use of the material that we did have, even if it was deeply flawed or incomplete. How do we still kind of find ways to wring out a narrative that helps to really talk about and explain Black women's history in a way that is doing justice to the history, but also I think in kind of serving readers now in the 21st century. So, as for me, it's always a challenge finding, Black women in this story, but I think I spent a lot more time trying to figure out what can I do with this partial record, or if we have a little bit of a voice or there's a photo, can we find a way to somehow make that speak for these sisters? So that's sort of been where I'm at with it.
Right, thank you. And what about you, Jeanne?
So one of the challenges of doing someone like Rosa Parks, which was different than the work I'd done before, in that there were so many interviews, right? In some sense, there was this surfeit of material. And yet, on the other hand, they tended to ask the same questions. They often, not all, but some tended to not wait for the answers, right? So she would say something and I'd be like, wait, why don't you follow up? And then for me, one of my big interests was telling the second half of her life, right? So Rosa Parks is forced to leave Montgomery 8 months after the boycotts end. She's lost her job. Her husband's lost his job. And they moved to Detroit, where her brother and her cousins are. And she spends more than half of her life there in Detroit, fighting the racism of the North. And I was really committed to telling that half of the story, in part because, as many of you know, one of my areas of research has been the civil rights struggle outside the South. And just, it seemed like one of the ways that Rosa Parks had been trapped on the bus was not actually telling the second half of her story. And many, many of these interviews actually were in Detroit. She worked as an aide to Congressman Conyers in his Detroit office doing constituent work for about 23 years. And many of these interviews took place there, and yet they don't ask anything about Detroit. They don't ask anything about, she's working for Conyers, and they don't say to him, what do you think about the congressman's agenda? Or what do you think about Vietnam? Or what do you think about, the war on poverty, or these revelations about COINTELPRO, right? Things that you would imagine if she'd been a man who had been a civil rights activist in the South turned congressional worker in the North, you would have gotten. And so I think one of the things was how to tell that second half of the story, and how to think about some of the silences. And then, of course, I had to do a lot of interviews. And clearly when you're doing just a biography of one person, not an incredible collective biography like Daina and Callie did, it's easier to do the kind of oral history work, which I did, which forms the heart of the second half of the book.
Yeah. And Jeanne, just to stay with you for a moment. So what do you think from telling this longer story about Rosa Parks? I mean, you started with that image of her funeral, and that her funeral and the narrative about her that was being spun had something to do with a kind of national narrative that was being put forward in that moment. So now stepping back and getting a bigger view of Rosa Parks, how does that change or revise or help us think differently about that bigger national narrative?
I mean, I think when you see the kind of fullness of her kind of life, so the title of the book is actually taken from a quote by Rosa Parks, where she talks about having a life history of being rebellious. And so I think when we sit with that, I think we see at least a couple of things. I think the first thing we see is this huge history of activism, of really hard activism in the 2 decades before her bus stand, where she and a kind of small group of activists in Montgomery are, pressing around issues of criminal justice, pressing around issues of voter registration, pressing around issues of desegregation. And they're doing this for years, and they basically get almost nothing. And so, she's talking and writing about how difficult this is, how crazy making it is, how isolating it is, how, we would call it like she's getting burned out, right? She's talking about being bitter. She's talking about, how it's difficult to keep going when all our efforts seem in vain. So I think part of what her story gives us, right, is how long, that we like it, like in some sense, the way we tell the civil rights story makes it easier. It makes it neater. It obviously gives us a happy ending. And I think looking at the first half of her story gives us just really how hard it was, and just generations of work, and people like Mrs. Parks and lots of people in a Black women's history of the United States really working without a sense that they're going to see change in their lifetime, right? I think what the second half of her life gives us, actually, and I think the other really damaging, I think there are many damaging things about the myths of Rosa Parks, but one is the way it traps her in the distant past, right? And she would talk about how people would ask her if she knew Harriet Tubman. Because I think the way we've just told the bus story is it seems so far done and gone, right? And then when you see Rosa Parks in Detroit, and when you see her sitting on the People's Tribunal in 1967, trying to hold the police accountable for killing 3 Black teenagers during the Detroit uprising, right? Or when you see her sitting in prisoner kind of defense committee meetings in the 1970s, or doing reparations work, right? all of a sudden, right, it's a much more contemporary story. It speaks to us in the present. And I think it resists the kind of ways that some commentators kind of make this very sort of strong line between current movements like Black Lives Matter and then the good civil rights movement. And I think when you see Rosa Parks on the People's Tribunal or doing, work around Angela Davis or the Wilmington 10 or Gary Tyler, like Joanne Little, all these prisoner defense committee, you see kind of the continuities between what she's doing and Black Lives Matter today. And so it really disrupts that way that, again, people try to weaponize the civil rights movement against current social movements.
And to you, Doctors Berry and Gross, I was thinking about the way in which the New York Times 1619 Project attempted to shift our discussion about the nation by pointing our attention to that date on like that year, 1619. But your story starts actually even before that. I was really intrigued by the opening. I like that phrase you used, Jeanne, of a kind of collective biographies. Like there's using these specific women's stories. You start with a woman named Isabel de Olvera before 1619. So could you just talk a little bit about kind of the scope of your book and what you hope is a shift in the way people think about U.S. history from some of these moves that you make in the book?
That's a great question. We were thinking about it because the book was going to come. This was right around the time of the anniversary of 2019. So we were thinking about we were writing around finishing.
Daina, if you can hear us, I think you're frozen. So I'll go ahead and pick up and hopefully we'll get Daina back.
Thank you.
Sure. One of the things that we worked really hard on was trying to sort of dislodge this narrative of Black womanhood purely from, especially in the US, as being automatically having their origins in enslavement. And so starting with Isabel de Olvera, who actually was a mixed Black woman who came to what is now New Mexico as an explorer. She actually went through great pains to go before the courts and get the documentation to demonstrate that she was in fact a free woman, that she was not, burdened by either marriage or like enslavement, that she had the right to go. And she came to the shores basically demanding justice and affirming her right to travel. And so that story actually serves as this kind of theme for us throughout the book, this idea of the ways that Isabel is demanding justice. And I see that Dr. Berry is back. So I don't know if you heard or you want to pick up. I was just mentioning how Isabel de Olvera's demand for justice kind of serves as this longer theme in the book.
Absolutely. Sorry about that. I've had a lot of trouble with my Zoom in the evenings. So hopefully that won't happen again. Yeah, we thought that we wanted to start off with someone who was free. Here is a Black woman or woman of African and Indian descent who was free. And we didn't want to start off as people being enslaved. And so that was a really important starting point for us. And it was also around the time when people were debating about when the first Africans came. Was it 1619? And when we should talk about our founding of the nation as 1776 or 1619. And we thought people were here before Europeans arrived. Native and indigenous populations were here for generations. And so much of American history started off at British arrival. And so here's a woman coming up from Mexico that wants to participate in an expedition and needs paperwork to protect herself. And so we just thought, what a great person to start off this project with, because she's free, she's traveling on her own, on her own accord. And she wants to make sure everybody knows that she's not bound by marriage or slavery, which we love. And that was just the right starting point for us. And then it was before 1619 was even more perfect. We spent about a year doing research on her, looking at other travel records, trying to understand what routes they would have gone, to know the topography of the land, what other women would she have been around. And we spent a long time with her. And there's so much more I think we could learn about her, but in a year. That's what we came up with, and that's why we started with her.
I just want to add one other sort of piece to that discussion. When we talked about the way that theme, that demand for justice really guides a lot of the telling of history that we do. Throughout the studies, I mean, I learned so much just about Black women's history, and there's still so much more to learn. But one of the things that I'm just in awe about are the ways that Black women have sort of fought tirelessly for justice and equality from the very beginning. And in ways great and small, right? So whether these are Black women who are organizing collectively, like in some of the earliest civil rights movements, like the National Association for Colored Women, right, founded in the late 19th century, right, fighting for everything from anti-lynching to suffrage to trying to help, impoverished people in the community, but even to individual, like incredible acts of bravery. I mean, I think about Mamie Till making this decision, she's not, necessarily like this long time activist in the struggle. But when this moment comes, she makes this heart-rending decision to show her son's, battered corpse to the world. And it just, sets in motion, I think, this whole other sort of chain reaction. And so I was just in awe of all the ways that Black women contribute to these movements, and that even they somehow seem to know their own sort of presence or their moment in history. So even like, Alice Coachman in 1948 winning this Olympic gold medal, right? She knew that if she didn't do well, there wouldn't be someone else after her, right? Shirley Chisholm is fighting, in Congress, and she gets there, she's repping her district, shout out to, 12th district in Brooklyn, but she also makes it plain, right, that she's there to open the doors for a whole bunch of other people who are looking just like her to keep coming through. And that, to me, is this powerful piece about Black women's history.
It's really powerful in the book. And one thing that was enjoyable is that you kind of stumble upon names that and you see them now in this kind of context and continuity. There's Lucy Parsons, there's Claudia Jones. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's names that you don't know. And I'm wondering, you just shared some, Dr. Gross. I'm wondering, Dr. Berry, if you have some that you'd like to share from the book of
the women that I wanted to share that we didn't know. Many of them were unnamed women. They were in the period of slavery, and we made the decision to still tell their stories, even if we just knew that this was one Negro wench, which was the term that was used sometime, or one Negro woman, and we didn't know anything else about her. So there were stories like that we wanted to tell, like the woman from the American Revolution. I don't know her name. We don't know the men's names either, but we still felt like her story was important. All the women on slave ships, we felt that their stories were important, and to describe and to think about what it was like to be on the ship, how that quote unquote horrific journey took. We wanted people to understand the depth of Black womanhood and the depths of their experiences and the diversity of their experiences. And so that's why we try to put tons of stories. And I don't know if we shared this yet, but we did a manuscript workshop with 10 other sister scholars at Rutgers University. And it was at that workshop that we decided, we were told that we should include, we had originally written the book with just as many names of people that you've never heard of. And we didn't have all the big names in there. We had them, and they were like, where's Harriet Tubman? I'm like, everybody knows Harriet Tubman. Where's Sojourner Truth? Everybody knows Sojourner Truth. And they said, no, you have to go back and put them in. You need to anchor the other enslaved women that you're talking about. You need to anchor the other activist women during the civil rights movement with a Rosa Parks and a Claudette Colvin and other women that were activists at the time. Otherwise, your reader is not going to understand the full context. And that's exactly what you just said. So there's tons of women. I think the McCoy twins are two women I wanted to write about for years. I'd met one of their descendants in 2007 and spent a lot of time when we were living in North Carolina, and they said that so much about their lives was about their bodies being examined. But Callie and I wanted to tell the story of their mother and what it was like for their family to own, to have their children be taken away from them, age 2, and then put on display male doctors viewing their genitalia on a regular basis, and then their mother going all the way to Europe to get them back. I mean, that was a powerful story, that the strength and power of Black women and unknown women that you may never have heard of, that we wanted to tell.
And thank you. And Jeanne, I know there's so much to Rosa Parks, parts to her activism. One of the things I was most intrigued by is her connection to the Scottsboro Boys and her connection to labor movement and the kind of old left. But do you have a favorite story that emerged in your research about Rosa Parks that people don't know about her that you like to tell?
Well, I guess maybe I'll tell two things. So part of thinking about why to do the young adult version is the ways that I think she gets used in this very saccharine way around young people. And like she's sort of constantly, I mean, you know, there's no young person who goes to school in the United States today who doesn't learn about Rosa Parks, right? But she's made prissy, she's made passive, she's, again, it's like a one-hit wonder. And like she's talked about as being kind of committed to young people, or she likes young people. But in fact, Rosa Parks, part of what Rosa Parks loves about young people is how militant they are. And she's constantly talking about how her peers at moments are too complacent. And so at these really key moments, like in 1954, she helps to refound the youth branch of the Montgomery NAACP because she's really kind of feeling like the adult, there's never going to be a mass movement. And in fact, she goes to Highlander Folk School, right? Highlander's an adult organizer training school, gets started in the 1930s. In the summer of 1955, she goes to a 2-week workshop around implementing school desegregation. At the end of that 2-week workshop, she finds it really uplifting, but still in all, at the end of the 2-week workshop, they do the go around like any good organizer training. What are you going to do when you go home? They get to Mrs. Parks and she says, there's never going to be a mass movement in Montgomery. And I think this gets back to Callie's point, right? Of like this amazing ability to kind of keep going, even when you can kind of believe something like that, right? She's like, it's the cradle of the Confederacy. It's too violent, you know, and Black people aren't unified. And so she says, what I'm going to do is go home and kind of redouble my efforts with young people. Because again, she really felt like young people's energy, their militancy, their ability to like do things that she would sometimes complain in her, you know, very kind of Rosa Parks, you know, shy kind of way about how, you know, all the adults just like to talk about process and the young people just got down to business. I think we fast forward, you know, 10, 15, 20 years, and this is the same thing she loves about Black power, right? And it's that same sense of kind of young people's energy and militancy and just kind of getting things done. And so I heard a lot of stories, again, as I'm doing the oral histories for the second half of the book. And again, these really speak to me now, you know, being a more middle-aged person, of just like, this is Mrs. Parks in her middle age, basically all these young activists saying, she would say, if I can be helpful, I'll come. So when they ask her to be part of this People's Tribunal to hold these cops accountable, she's like, if I can be helpful, I'll come. And people told me over and over, she's everywhere. She went to Black Power Conference in Philly in 68. She's part of a group of Black delegates in 68 who refused to endorse any of the candidates because she thinks they're not accountable to the Black community. She, you know, one of my favorite pictures is her and Erica Huggins when she visits the Panther School, right? So I think this idea of how she loves young people is really, you know, kind of really misses what she actually loves about young people, which is like their feistiness and their militancy. And again, I think takes us, if we fast forward to the present, kind of where she would be standing today.
Thank you. When I think about common themes between your books, one that comes to mind is violence, and particularly sexual violence. And I'm wondering, we'll start with you, Jeanne. Rosa Parks, part of the beginning of her activism is dealing with the pervasive problem of sexual violence. Can you just tell us a little bit about that history that people may not know about her?
Yeah. And I think this gets us to where what you were saying about Scottsboro, because we cannot understand how Rosa Parks gets it sort of involved in the network she does, and particularly how she comes to the Recy Taylor case, without understanding that sort of she, in her late teens, she meets and falls in love with what she describes as the first real activist I ever met, and that is Raymond Parks. He's a 28-year-old politically active barber. He's working on the Scottsboro case. Again, 9 young men who get arrested riding the rails, and then when 2 young white men are found, right, those young men are arrested, and all but the youngest, who's 12, sentenced to death. Right, so this local movement grows in Alabama to protect and defend the Scottsboro boys, and Raymond Parks is one of those local activists. And so in the first years, he's the more public activist, she's more behind the scenes. Now, by the 1940s, she comes to want to be more active in her own right. And she both joins the local NAACP, but also through these connections, these Scottsboro connections. And again, through connections that are very much tied to the American Communist Party, right? They come to hear about the Recy Taylor case. And that is a case of a Black woman, Recy Taylor, in Abbeville, Alabama, who was gang raped on her walk home from a meeting at church. And so they learn about the case from other Scottsboro organizers, actually from a white woman by the name of Carolyn Balin. And Mrs. Parks then goes down to sort of see more about the case. And I think very much, these are kind of two sides of the same coin for her, right? Both the wrongful accusations and over-incarceration of Black men, and then the lack of protection, the lack of justice for sort of Black women. And we're going to see this again in the decade of work that she does with the Montgomery NAACP before her bus stand. She's working on other cases, Gertrude Perkins in Montgomery, right? So trying to make the law answerable and work for Black women, and at the same time trying to protect sort of Black men from the law, if you will. And then we see that again, she's one of the co-founders of the Detroit chapter of the Free Joanne Little movement. So that commitment and sort of thinking about sexual violence, you can see kind of across her life. But again, I think it's really important to understand that how that's coming out of the left. And I think in the recent ways, we've kind of started to like bring these stories back. I think we take out that, and I think that doesn't do justice to kind of the organizers who are doing the work in this.
And Doctors Gross and Berry, this is also a theme throughout your book, violence and sexual violence. And I guess stepping back and looking at it as a whole, I'm wondering if you could just articulate, first of all, how is this such a pervasive pattern across this history, and why you think it is?
I would say because it's when you look at the period of enslavement and Black women's bodies being used however people tried to use them without their consent. Right. The fact that mothers raised their daughters to protect themselves. One woman said, protect your principal. That was something that was common for generations. And that was something they fought for generations. They grew up knowing that. Some of them bound their breasts so that you couldn't tell they were going through puberty, while their enslavers were busy writing back and forth to get advice from other enslavers to find out how they could tell when a young girl went through puberty, so they could then have them bring in additional sources of labor. When you see I think we still have so much more work to do in this area. People are now finally starting to be a little bit okay with admitting that most white men during slavery had their way with Black women, period. And even if we just looked at the records of Black women, we can say that almost every single record of enslaved Black women, and I know people are going to push back against this, but most of the records, they'll talk about it openly, that they were abused. Harriet Jacobs writes about the foul things that her enslaver whispered in her ears. They dreaded puberty. So that's how prevalent it was. When you take that beyond slavery and you go into the Jim Crow South, and you go into a period in an area of our history where Black women are still working in homes, often still in the homes of their former enslavers or their sons and grandsons, who were also their enslavers, you're going to see that level of disrespect and abuse that continues. So Black women were always and have always been fighting for their bodies and to protect themselves.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Dr. Berry said. The only thing I wanted to just add and sort of highlight is that the US legal system plays a really important role in in creating the conditions that allow for the endemic rape of Black women. So of course, during enslavement, not only do you have the legislation that basically incentivizes Black women's rape by saying that the status of their children would be dependent upon their status, right? So if you were enslaved, no matter who fathered your child, that you would give birth to another enslaved human being. But even even during that time, you have rape laws spring up that have really specific punishments for white men who are accused of rape or the attempted rape of a white woman or girl. You have a set of harsher punishments for any Black male who was accused of rape or the attempted rape of a white woman or girl. And those same laws that had that level of specificity make no mention of any punishment for rape for a Black woman or girl by either a white or Black man. So the legal system plays a powerful role in sort of creating these conditions that allow Black women to be raped and also separating them from any sort of protection. But even after and at the same time, there's this myth that springs up about Black women as being immoral, low women, that they don't have virtue that needs to be protected by the law. And so that mythology really endures. So even after emancipation, you still have this myth about Black women and the same sort of double standards in terms of who is actually punished or even accused of rape or sexual assault. Even as Black women continue to organize against it, continue to go on record and try to testify that they did not consent. Jeanne has spoken powerfully about Rosa Parks's activism. I look at their efforts, even during the Civil War, after the Civil War, during the Memphis riots, where you have women who are gang raped go before a Senate committee in 1866 to say that they did not consent, that they were raped, right? So that history, I just don't want us to miss the legal system's role in creating those conditions and maintaining it for as long as it was allowed to go on. And arguably, Black women who are victimized still face these kinds of stereotypes.
Well, that's actually where I was going to go next. You write about how Black women are not one thing. There's not one type of Black woman, Black women. Black women are people. So there's, all types. But they're often facing similar conditions because of being Black women. And sometimes part of, or often what's wrapped up in those conditions are some kind of myth or stereotype or image that's being put on them. And so I wonder if you could talk more about some of the ways that those myths changed and evolved over time. It seems like it's a constant. I'm thinking, in the later period, the demonization of Black women and mothers in the build up to mass incarceration. But there's more. I mean, there's many more.
And there are more here.
So that is a harder question, in part because, and this is the pessimist in me in some ways, because part of the reason I'm having difficulty with your question is because you asked, how has it changed?
Yeah.
And so this is a challenge for me because I'm not entirely convinced that it has. We move from those images of Black women as being low, immoral, and unchaste. These are attitudes that still endure today. I mean, it was definitely made worse by things like the Moynihan Report and these sort of, this rhetoric that pathologized Black women and single mothers, depicted Black women as emasculating and sort of gestating this sort of urban pathology, also depicting them as extractive and overly dependent on welfare. But the sad part is that I think that Black women have done a lot to push back against these narratives, to fight these stereotypes at every turn. But unfortunately, I think a lot of those attitudes have endured. And we see those kinds of things, I think, indicative of certain policy changes, even the ways that Black women are, how they fare in the justice system. There's a sort of prevailing idea about Black women as being dishonest. This bleeds into even Black women's inability to access adequate health care, right? There's always this sort of a layer of surveillance and suspicion, the idea that they are not being honest about their pain or about their condition, these sorts of circumstances. So I think those, unfortunately, have endured, though not without contest.
I would agree. I would completely agree with that. And I think that's the struggle. We struggled with not making a book about doom and gloom, because there's a lot of that in Black history. There's a lot of Black joy in Black history as well. But we also wanted to tell the truth. And when we tell the truth, that was a common experience for so many Black women. We talk about this when we teach our courses. When we get to the 20th century, a lot of students for intro courses on African-American history, they're worn out. They're like, okay, we went from slavery to Jim Crow to lynching, and where's the break, And so we were trying to find multiple stories to tell, not just the stories that are common threads. And it's, not just those stories, but what other stories could we tell that showed the diversity of our experiences, but also the truth about our experiences. And it's not a lot of the same problems we've had 100 years ago, we are still dealing with today.
Right. And Jeanne, I wonder if you want to talk about the kind of myths or ideas of womanhood or Black womanhood that Rosa Parks dealt with. I don't know if you want to go in this direction, but in my mind goes to the way you write about her appearance and the way she decided to present herself to the world, which, we're so familiar with her image, but you kind of unpack for us how she constructed that image. Do you want to talk about that, her in relation to Blackness and womanhood?
So I guess my mind actually went in a slightly different direction, which is the ways that I think the image of Rosa Parks and the middle classification of Rosa Parks actually misses how much suffering Rosa Parks had and what her bus stand actually entailed for her family and her for a decade. And I think we now have this, I think what I would call this revisionist myth, right? Which is like the respectable middle-class Rosa Parks against Claudette Colvin, right? Which doesn't do either of them justice and actually has created this new myth around Claudette Colvin, that Claudette Colvin was pregnant. She was not pregnant when they decide not to pursue her case. Rosa Parks was one of the, Colvin talks about Parks being the only adult who kind of stays in touch with her that summer, but in part because Rosa Parks is trying to get Colvin to take more leadership in the NAACP Youth Council. So I think there's these ways that we have these images of Black women, and Rosa Parks has come to stand in for this kind of middle-class respectability politics, which both does not do, doesn't do justice to like her story. She's a working class woman. She's living in the projects when she makes her bus stand. But then 5 weeks in, she loses her job. Her husband loses his job. They never find steady work ever again. And then they're getting death threats. So if you look at kind of what happens, I mean, it's catastrophic. And the papers that opened at the Library of Congress of Rosa Parks in 2015, include her income tax records and stuff, and all sorts of financial papers. And you can just see how harrowing it is for them, because even after they move to Detroit, it gets worse. And they can't find work. She gets ulcers that get worse. She ends up in the hospital in December of 1959. They can't pay the bill. She goes into collections. And so I think part of the way that Rosa Parks is presented to us, right, in this kind of one day wonder, one hit wonder, is also misses the kind of experience of Rosa Parks, right? And that suffering, and that it's really a decade of suffering. And in the book, and one of the heroes in my book is John Conyers, right? So she's volunteering on his first campaign for Congress in 64. He's like a young radical civil rights lawyer. He wins the primary by 42 votes. It's like, it's a real upset. And he hires her to work in his Detroit office in 65. It's her first paid political position. She's been an activist for more than 2 decades. And it's only after a year of working for Conyers that the Parks family have an income sort of comparable to the year of her bus stand. So this is 11 years later, right? It's a decade of suffering. And so I think one of the things that I really have thought about is the way that the image of Rosa Parks actually also eclipses the actual experience of the woman, Rosa Parks, besides the work it does to kind of chastise other women. And it holds up this idea of like how you're supposed to be, that both was not how she was, but also then implicitly is about sort of saying other people are too loud, too unrespectable. So I think the image does a lot of really problematic work. But today I'm really thinking about the ways that it also erases her.
Right. Thank you. We're getting close to the time when we should take some questions from the audience. So if you are watching this and have a question, just type it into the chat and we will try to get to them shortly. But while I have the chance to ask questions, let me try to get a few more in. Well, actually, I'm wondering if we could zoom in a little bit on the moment of the bus stand, because it, occurs to me this is a moment of overlap in the books. The books come together in that moment. And I thought that I was like a knowledgeable person about Black. I know who Claudette Colvin is, I've read the book about Rosa Parks, but you've got, I lost count of the women who you all talk about also taking the same stand, not just at the same era, but at the same exact year. So why did you want to zoom out like that and give us that broader picture of other women taking the similar action? What were you hoping we would understand from that?
For us, it was part of a similar project. I mean, I think we all have been really influenced by Jeanne's powerful work on Rosa Parks and really sketching out this lifelong history of activism in a variety of capacities. And so for us, in showing that there were groups of Black women who protested and stood up against this, these racist, segregationist policies on the bus, for decades, was really important to stress. And so just to sort of highlight in that year alone, right, there were like at least 5 other women who stood up and said no, and were arrested for it. Right, that they actually go on to become a part of this case that wends its way through the court right alongside this movement. So it was just, again, about showing how all kinds of Black women stood up and fought, whether they were a part of an organized sort of collective and a body of resistance, or if they were just a Black woman who decided enough is enough. That, right, I've been disrespected enough. This is racist and it's wrong. I paid my money like everybody else, but I'm not going to place, right? And if you have to arrest me to, take me to jail, then so be it. And they were incredibly brave in that because they're often brutalized in the process, right? Dragged off, roughly kicked, punched, cursed, spit upon. It was important just to sketch out that arc and that continuum of resistance.
And also that people are learning from this. So that partly we get this federal case because in 1944 in Montgomery, a woman by the name of Viola White gets arrested on the bus. She presses her case. Mm-hmm. In retaliation, the police rape her daughter. But the other thing the state does in Viola White's case is they tie her appeal up in state court. And so one of the things that Montgomery's activists have learned is this danger that Rosa Parks' case may go nowhere. Mm-hmm. And so what they do in February of 1956, those women that Callie and Daina feature in that chapter, right? That case is called Browder v. Gale. But part of the reason they filed Browder v. Gale is because they've learned from these earlier experiences. And so they proactively file into federal court to try to circumvent what they fear is going to happen to Rosa Parks's case because it had happened to Viola White's case. right? And again, I think one of the dangerous ways that Rosa Parks' story gets taught and told is not just that she's the only one, but just somehow you can just come out of nowhere and make a stand, and then a boycott can happen, and then change happens. And I think it really robs us of understanding how change happens, and all of the kind of learning and mobilization and networks and all of the things that actually came together there. But part of that was that this woman had taken the stand a decade earlier, and they'd learned some of the state strategies. And so they're being strategic too, right? And
Dr. Barry, do you want to add to that?
Oh, no, I just think, I mean, Jeanne just made the last point about there's a legacy of activism that is, these are not all just flashpoints. There's organizing that had gone on and it was well planned in every time period in Black women's history. So that's, I mean, even Isabel Vera, she waited more than 8 months before she was able to go on the expedition. So, and had 3 witnesses that came to court for her to testify, you know, and she knew what she needed to take. So there's a long history of planning that's here. And we may only see them from a photograph. We may only see some Black women from just a picture that's worth 1,000 words that we see one time. And that picture represents so much about a moment. But there's a longer history of activism that I think we found in both of these books.
I'm wondering, it feels like both of these books feel like the right book at the right time. Like they're really meeting a moment. Like there's this hunger for Black women's stories right now. Does that seem right to you? And I just wonder if you could speak about the response you're getting to these books and why you think, if you agree with that, why is that happening right now? What is this moment for Black women's history?
I'll just say quickly, and then we had a really interesting history because the book came out about a year ago today, around now, about a year ago. And then the world shut down because of the pandemic, and we're still in a semi-shutdown, depending on what state you live in. But because of what happened with Breonna Taylor and a number of other Black women, Sandra Bland, you know, a number of other Black women historically going all the way back, and then the good things that are happening with people like Stacey Abrams and making political changes, and Vice President Harris, there's all kinds of stuff happening on a whole spectrum of both good and bad. And Black women are at the center of this. And so for that, and the suffrage, the anniversary of the 19th Amendment as well. Because of that, we're in a moment where people are curious, how did we get here? Black women didn't just appear out of a vacuum, like we say, but there's a whole history of these women. And I think people want to know more of their stories, and they want to know the spectrum of whose shoulders that these Black women are standing on.
Jeanne?
Yeah, I don't have a huge amount to add to that. I mean, I agree 100%. It's been really incredible for us to sort of see that interest, though, because it is a marked change in spite of all of this long time history of activism and organizing. You know, prior to this kind of moment, getting anyone to be interested in Black women's history was a pretty hard sell. And that was from publishers to people who are trying to write an op-ed about Black women in the criminal justice system, or who've been victimized by police brutality too. I mean, all of these things it was incredibly difficult to get any sort of traction or interest around those issues. So I'm personally excited to sort of see that there is this moment where kind of at last, there's some interest. It's okay to be speaking about Black women and Black women's history and not have it be viewed as divisive or taken away from like the larger sort of struggle for the community, that we have room for both, and that it's possible to acknowledge all of these contributions that have helped get us to where we are.
Right.
Not that where we are is not without flaws, but it's, that they do, want that history to be recognized also.
And have you noticed this shift, Jeanne, in the course of your work?
So I mean, certainly the response when I brought out the original book was sort of beyond my wildest imagination. And I had been very nervous. It took me years to write the book. And I was like, I mean, Mrs. Parks is not a hidden figure, right? She is. And so I was like, why hasn't someone done this? And like, is something, is it like, and then the more I dug, the more it's like, she's so much better than, I mean, even though she's, she's talked about and celebrated and honored, like she's so much better than the myth we're given, right? And so there's something really amazing about getting to get behind a myth and to find something even better there. And so one of the things, so I got my first op-ed on Mrs. Parks in the Times last month. And I should say it was not my first op-ed on Rosa Parks to be submitted to the Times, but it was the first one to be published. And one of the things that I really loved was that they gave it a headline that was like, basically like, she's better than you'd ever imagine. Because I felt like, oh, finally we're catching up to this, right? It's not just like, oh, there are myths about Rosa Parks. It's like this life of activism actually has more to show us and is more, even if we're going to be on the inspirational stories for young people, it's more inspirational. It's so much more inspirational. But I think one of the things is partly when you look at somebody like Rosa Parks and you see that her personal hero is Malcolm X, right? And she sees no contradiction between loving Martin and Malcolm, right? When you see that she spends more of her life fighting the racism of the North, when you see that she is a lifelong believer in self-defense, right? When you see that she also has this kind of global vision, right? And, 8 days after 9/11, she joins with other civil rights activists to call on the United States, no retaliation, no war, right? I mean, this kind of to the end of her life, right? This kind of robust politics, right? I mean, she very much, I think, helps us to see the road forward, right? In terms of, for activists and kind of what it means to be a long distance runner, and how you do it and how hard it is, right? I think there is something also about seeing how much she writes about how hard it is, right? How lonely it feels, how crazy she feels, how it's hard to stay sane in the midst of white supremacy, right? I think there's something very useful about that too, in terms of the, for younger activists. I mean, for older activists too, but for young people as well.
All right, we have a really good crop of questions already. Feel free to keep them coming. We'll get to as many as we can. So what I'm going to do is just throw some out and, have at it. And when I can, I'll try to lump them together as much as possible. But here's one that it jumps out to me, at least as being something important. Ellen writes, how does the union drive at Amazon in Alabama with a majority Black female workforce fit into the history and trajectory of Black women that we are discussing today? I think it does, but I'm dying to hear how you all respond to that. Jeanne, can we start with you?
Yeah. So when Rosa Parks makes her bus stand, she's working at Montgomery's biggest department store, Montgomery Fair. And everybody knows Rosa Parks is a seamstress, but I think we don't spend a ton of time thinking about what her work life is. Montgomery Fair is a segregated department store, which means that Black people can shop there, but they can't try on clothes. And so when Rosa Parks is working in the men's shop there, it means that she is spending her life, as she puts it, right, making life easy and clever for white people, right? She's basically tailoring white men's suits. And that phrase, I think, does also speak to, in some ways, the ways that Amazon workers have made all of our lives easy and clever, in this pandemic. And we have relied increasingly much on places like Amazon. And yet, right, that as workers, right, that not having that work be respected. And I think there's no way to understand how Rosa Parks gets to her breaking point separate also from her work life, right? And so what it means to have your work be making life easier for other people, but then no recognition of your own life and your own kind of needs.
Thank you.
Sure. I think it definitely follows along this trajectory of Black women's labor organizing in a lot of different ways. I mean, I think back to even at the turn of the century when, Black women in Atlanta basically organized as laundresses to try to price control to get better wages and to be treated with more dignity and respect. Also think about Black women who organized during the 1930s, during the Depression, how they, worked and organized labor strikes at factories to try to get and improve their wages and working conditions, but also even in places like, New York and the Bronx, where they talked about like Black women, being on like slave markets and being exploited by white women who are looking for cheap day labor, and how, women would be standing on corners basically trying to barter to get a job to make ends meet. There is a long trajectory of Black people fighting, especially with respect to labor organizing and unionizing in rights. This is true even in the garment industry. Even though a lot of these organizations initially were discriminatory and would not allow for their participation, this doesn't impede them or stop them from continuing to fight for access and fair labor and better working conditions.
And I've even seen examples of, we didn't write about it in this book, but of enslaved women doing work stoppage. They actually would get the entire plantation. There was one woman in Georgia that I talk about named Cinda, who got them to stop working for 3 weeks, and it caused financial hardship for the enslaver. And he was so angry that she could get an entire plantation to listen to her, but they wouldn't listen to him. And he lost a lot of money on that crop year. So that's just another example that even that grassroots organizing, even the work in political labor, political organizing that Fannie Lou Hamer did with farm workers. So it's across the whole time period, and I think that's what we see often. We see that very often.
Thank you. We have a series of questions that I'm going to just read all together, and you could kind of take whatever pieces of it you want to respond to, because they're all related one way or another to the writing of history and research and resources. So a username that is difficult to read writes, "Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I want to ask Dr. Gross and Dr. Berry about speculation. How much of your work required speculation? Do you think a certain degree of speculation is needed when writing Black women's history? I'm a current history graduate student who studies Black women, and I've come across a lot of resistance to the use of speculation. Any advice would be greatly appreciated. Thank you." Oh, sorry, Sekodri. Nia writes, "Clearly, excavating these stories remains arduous work. If you were to put out a blueprint of 3 wishes, what resources, allies would you institute to change the game so we can truly flesh out our narratives? Who, what, and related, who, what proved the most disappointing source or resource in your project to tell these stories? Conversely, the most surprising, pleasantly so."
So I'll take a stab. Those are great questions. And I would love to encourage just to the graduate students that are out there, we're all very much into the archives in our work. If I could spend my weekends at the archives, I would be there every weekend. That's where all the gems are. But there are also gems in people's backyards, in their basements, in their grandmother's scrapbook, in the Bible, in, between sheets and underneath floorboards and houses. So what gets into the archive is one thing, and how it comes to the archive is a deliberate act often, or somebody stumbled on something. So if we're looking at traditional historical archives at historical societies and libraries, you have to ask. For me, I ask questions. So I think here's a Black woman that I stumble upon in an 88-page journal. She's mentioned 6 times. So what is it about? When does she appear? What do they not say about her? What do they say about her? And what kinds of questions, if I want to tell this scene from her perspective, how would I write this story of this 88-page journal with her as the lead? And that's sort of my process. And I ask a lot of questions. I know Dr. Gross and I went back and forth because sometimes we felt like at one point the editors were saying that we had a little bit too many questions. We'd say, what is this? What is that? We wanted to get the reader to think beyond what was available for us to confirm in the historical record. So we do have to use imagination. And it's not that we're not making up things, we're just expanding your viewpoint, because oftentimes our stories are not there from our perspective. And so we have to, like, we're writing the stories about enslaved people from the enslavers' records. We're writing about a person on trial from the court record. And we don't have evidence of their testimony or something like that. So those are the first things. And then what would we want to change for me? And I know Dr. Gross might have something, Dr. Theoharis might have something different as well. But I think part of the change is, if we're looking at traditional archives, having a diversity in those archives, having to go back and look at descriptive inventories again, instead of having an inventory that describes a letter between a husband and wife, but maybe the last paragraph is all about enslaved people. Then what would it look like if you wrote that inventory from the perspective of the enslaved families that were discussed? So instead of putting us as afterthoughts in the archive, what would it look like if we had an entire archive that allowed us to be front and center? And how many sources would we appear in that we were just overlooked or part of the scenery? So that's one thing, is to change the way we catalog and also the way we acquire items for archives. And that's just the traditional archives.
Yeah, I know a place like that.
Exactly.
Dr. Gross, do you want to chime in, or Dr. Theoharis, do you want to chime in on any of these points, or shall we move on?
I'll just say two sort of quick things. One, about the question of speculation. I think that making informed inferences is completely fine and acceptable, especially if you're basing it on like historical context. I think it's fine to sort of speculate in those places. And I think we're seeing more of that. And I know that folks are starting to take that a lot farther. And I think, it can be beautifully done and written well. One of the fears that I tend to have about how far we can go is that I don't want to speak in place of these folks either. And so sometimes for me, that was a challenge in when we did come across sources that were sort of scant, or we didn't fully have, what we would love, the women's own voices in every space. Trying to find ways to make what we have work without sort of overstepping and presuming to kind of speak for them. So that was certainly something that I struggle with and kind of continue to struggle with, even as I think that we do need to be bold and try to think about new ways to discover other kinds of sources, and also to make what we have do more work, sort of. So I think it's going to be an ongoing. So for the graduate student out there, I'm sorry, I don't have the answer with a capital A, but that's sort of where I'm at. And with respect to the question about what was the most surprising, I try not to focus on the disappointment. So I'm going to just bypass that and get to the most surprising is, I tell a story in the book about Frances Thompson, and I've been wanting to sort of work her in all night, because one of the things I'm really proud about our book is that we really try to talk about all kinds of Black women, and centering Black queer women's experiences was a huge part of that project. And so we talk about Frances Thompson, who was one of the women who I mentioned earlier, who testifies about being assaulted in 1866. But after she does that, she kind of becomes persona non grata locally. She's basically harassed by authorities for the next 10 years. And in 1876, they actually arrest her on suspicion of being a man in woman's clothing, even though she maintains that she is of double sex and chose to live as a woman. They subject her to these examinations. They determine that she's biologically male, and she's actually imprisoned for it. And she's, during her time, she's subject to ridiculing questions about her gender identity, and she never loses the fight. She tells them, none of your damn business. She survives her stint in prison, but she dies shortly thereafter in 1876. But I think her story is super important because it shows how hard Black women fought to reclaim and define womanhood for themselves, and that all kinds of Black women were engaged in that struggle and have been historically throughout our sort of study. But in writing about her, I was, I would love to have had like an image of her or a picture. This is 1876. I took like a shot in the dark and ended up finding someone had a copy of the day's doings, a paper from 1876 that actually had historical etchings of, guess who? Yes, friends, Francis Thompson. And so this was a shock, a surprise, never in a million years would I have expected to find that. And so now I'm going to be donating this document to an archive. Yes, we'll be in touch about this document, and also thinking about ways that we can maybe make it be useful, especially for like the Black LGBTQ archives and resources.
Jeanne?
So probably the most frustrating experience I had, and this was in writing the original book, was that a whole section of Rosa Parks's papers were caught up in a dispute about her estate and being held at a fancy auction house in New York City. And they refused to let any scholars in. And again, that would be unthinkable if you were auctioning the papers of Martin Luther King or Eleanor Roosevelt or Ralph Bunche, but somehow with Rosa Parks, it was okay not to. And I tried and I published the original book without seeing them because it just didn't, it was years and years and years. And then Howard Buffett, son of Warren Buffett, ultimately broke that logjam, and he bought them, and he donated them to the Library of Congress. And so the happy ending of this story is now they are at the Library of Congress, but they've also been digitalized, so you can see the papers online. In them, there's a small trove of her personal writings, which are, it is a really rare look at her personal voice. And but it was very scary to publish the book without seeing them. And we put I put a new introduction on the book in 2015 when I got to see them. And, in many ways, the papers thankfully just expanded the themes in the book. But obviously it's very intimidating for an historian to basically forge out. And then I remember the archivist at the Library of Congress said to me, she's like, Jeanne, I've been reading and trying to find where the papers are going to contradict your book. And so far, and I was like, but they're extraordinary. And so I really recommend, and they're digital, they're hard to use online, but they're all there. So it's really worth looking at because it's, and again, extraordinary that Howard Buffett is who comes through on this.
Thank you. Let me read another suite of 3 questions for you, or groups of questions for you to chew on. An anonymous attendee writes, a lot of these issues, and these are all 3 relate to activism one way or another. A lot of these issues regarding the demonization of Black women and anti-Blackness. I'm a Black girl entering her junior year of high school, and I can be pretty passive. Do you have any advice for how to get involved in Black activism and become more outspoken in what I believe in? Another anonymous attendee writes, activism is mostly depicted as a life dedicated to long suffering, enduring the process. Are there windows into the person, the activist, that display healing in activism or any positive emotions associated with activism? And lastly, Nancy writes, in your research, can any of you speak to what might be called burnout by Black women who tried to lead the way? Can you draw any conclusions about how these women persevered? And did any of them feel like they'd had enough and just wanted to live their lives?
I'll start. I think certainly there are so many moments where Rosa Parks seems to be getting to her limit, and yet she presses forward. I think a couple of things sustain her. I haven't talked tonight very much about faith, but there's no way to talk about Rosa Parks. She's a woman of deep faith, and I think that faith is really important. I think the second thing is it's not just a Christian faith, but a sort of belief that dissent is worth it. Like, and she says this in various different ways, that you just want to be on record, and that there was something that was kind of both useful, rejuvenating, healing about just being on record as dissenting, even if you couldn't necessarily have any sense that you were going to change the thing. So I think part of it, again, in looking at how she keeps going, is partly about the value in just saying no, right? And just saying, I don't agree. I think, and Stephanie Evans has written about this recently in terms of Rosa Parks's like yoga practice. I think there are things that we can see in terms of what we now would talk about as sort of self-care practices. And I think some of those are things like yoga and she cans, she quilts, she does all sorts of those kinds of things. But I think the other thing is that she keeps herself in community with other activists. And one of the stories I love to tell is the story of how Malcolm X and her first meet. And it's in 1963, and he's come to Detroit. He's giving what, we now know as the message to the grassroots. And he puts out the word that he wants to meet her. And I interviewed a lot of people to to write the book. And one of the people I interviewed was Peter Bailey, who was one of Malcolm's right-hand men. And Mr. Bailey said to me that there were two people in the civil rights movement that Malcolm talked about just in awe. And they were Fannie Lou Hamer and Rosa Parks. And so he wants to meet her. And I think, to me, that offers a lot in terms of, like, I think sometimes we also think of Malcolm as some kind of lone ranger, and he's just an Energizer bunny, and you keep going. And I think what we see in this meeting and what we see in him wanting to meet her is that, like, activists need other activists, right? Courage needs courage, right? The kind of tremendous sustenance I think she and other activists get from being in community with other people, right? And that, like, in some ways there's the burnout, but in other ways, part of what I think keeps her going is being in community with so many other activists, again, over such a long period of time.
I actually want to jump in and pick up on that point in answering the question from the young person out there, because I think it's super important, and I don't want to end without addressing that. One, I think it's incredibly brave that you're here. When I was in high school, the last thing I would have done is attend a lecture on Black women's history. So thank you for being here, staying with us this long. And what I would say is, continue to educate yourself, but also try to find other like-minded young folks too, who are also questioning, who are thinking about these issues, and don't sort of beat yourself up for not being confident. I think that there are all kinds of ways that people express confidence and show strength. Being here, asking the question, educating yourself, wanting to sort of grow and move in and be a force to contest anti-Blackness is already a powerful thing. So recognize and acknowledge that. And then also, in terms of just being shy in general and for speaking, just how you ask the questions, this was one of the ways that when I was in high school, I would sort of try to fight back. I actually had a scholarship to go to an elite private high school in New York, a native New Yorker, Trinity High School. Just to give you an idea, Lachlan Murdoch of the Murdoch Empire was actually in my class. So you can imagine the racial climate of this school. And after about a year of really racist incidents, some other students of color and I started banding together and talking about it. We formed our own little organization. I started practicing on how to, when someone said something crazy or out the way to me, how to just sort of ask them the question, what are you hoping to gain by this? What are you really trying to say? Does this make you feel powerful? Do you think you're smart? You don't always have to have a super comeback. You can just kind of try to put it back on them and practice cultivating that voice. And the first few times I would be shaking afterwards, right? Go in the bathroom and try to get my courage back up, and then turn around and go and do it again. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight. No one is expecting you to do that, but you're on the right path. So stay with it. And I salute you. Thank you for being here.
I love what you said to her. And I was actually thinking about, and I'll be brief because I know we have to close soon, but I was thinking about what both of you said. It's really about finding your community, finding a community, and that community may be a community of 2, maybe a community of 22, but there's a community for any activist once you focus on what it is that you are passionate about. And the other thing is sometimes you have to fight so people know that you will, but you also need to choose your battles. And so you'll know when it's time, you'll feel it in your gut and your soul when you're supposed to speak up. And I just wish you the best of luck, and know that there's a community of people waiting to join you.
Jeanne, do you want to chime in on that, or you?
I guess the only other thing is just like, obviously Rosa Parks is my favorite kind of shy militant, right? Like she is incredibly shy and reserved and struggles. She hates being in the public eye, right? I mean, so I think the other thing is, like, to me, one of the things really looking at Rosa Parks' life gives us is that you don't have to be a certain way to be like a lifelong freedom fighter, and you don't have to, right? And you can be really like nervous and reserved. And she talks about feeling like so nervous and bitter a lot of the time. And then at other moments, right? Like on the bus, that day on the bus, she speaks back to the cops, right? The cops get on the bus. They say in like cop form, why didn't you move? And Rosa Parks in that moment, she actually is not quiet. She says, why do you push us around, right? So also this idea that in the, there will be moments, right, when it's just like, okay, you can be shy, like that. She never stops being shy, but she also has all of these moments where the shyness, she is not quiet, even if she's shy. And you can be like, I think part of why it's been so hard to see people like Rosa Parks, and I think only recently we started to see Black women and Black power is precisely because we don't have this capacious sense of like all the different kinds of people that actually are radicals, are activists, are militants. And so that's partly what she gives me as someone who is also kind of shy.
Great. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions. And so maybe, in addition to your responses, throw in any last words you want to, chance for last words. These are both kind of about teaching. Antoinette asks, what, if any, enlightenment have you seen in your students about learning the history and stories? Also, in order to truly educate, you must have people who are open to hearing and dealing with these truths. That being said, how many of your students that are in your courses are not people of color who are open and are learning, able to accept these truths, making it necessary to begin a change in true historical acceptance? And Barbara asks, what continues to be the greatest challenge in getting our educational systems to include Black history in the history of America?
I'll be brief. We're fighting that battle. The last question, we're fighting that battle hard. It's with school districts, it's with school boards, it's with state education boards, and it's with textbooks. So it has to be fought, and parents and students need to demand it. If students demand it, it will come. So it's a multi-level, multi-layered fight that people are involved in right now, and we're going to continue to fight so that we don't lose generations and they don't come to our college classrooms shocked about the things that we're teaching. We can go deeper in college if they have a better understanding in pre-K through 12. So that'll be my last parting words for now.
Okay.
I agree with everything that Dr. Berry said. I would just add, in terms of one of the other questions about sort of how many folks are not folks of color who are reading the work or who are learning in classes. So I teach fairly sort of, I guess, mixed classes to begin with. So there's definitely a real interest. In terms of who's reading this book, if the feedback that we've gotten from folks is any indication, it's pretty widespread. I mean, we've talked to all kinds of groups and book clubs and organizations. I've been really blown away. And in some respects, I think that readership is sort of paralleling kind of the demographics that we saw last summer when, you know, the movement basically broke out against police brutality, that it was very diverse. And so I feel like that is what I've personally noticed in terms of our readership, but that is not sort of statistical by any stretch. It's based on the feedback and on the groups who have invited us to come and talk to them.
So I guess my last comments, well, the first is I know somebody in the chat wanted to know, so this is the work of Amos Kennedy. He's a Detroit-based artist, so you can look him up online. But yeah, he did these amazing posters. I think one of the dangers, and part of why I was so excited about sort of our conversation tonight, is I see one of the dangers in the textbooks being the kind of Black History Month posterification of Rosa Parks and kind of Black women's history, right? So now we're like at the pullout section, or we're at the like, do a special project on, you know, in February, you know, with your mom on, you know, some, you know, and it's like you do a paragraph or you do a thing. And I think both of what I think our books tonight do is to get us beyond the poster. And so to me, one of the dangers, right, is the kind of, and I obviously I talk about this a lot in terms of Rosa Parks, that honoring can be a form of stripping, right? And so I think part of it is to kind of push us past both, like just like, you know, again, the little section on the page, or you know, like a Black woman separated from the whole history of, you know, the rest of the course, right? So and to really then kind of look at the whole way the story of American history changes. And so, but again, I guess I would also end with like, I think there is an extraordinary hunger for it. And that part of like why I did the young adult book is because so very many people have asked me to do it, right? And so I think there is sometimes the kind of whatever, the like, if you build it, they'll come kind of feeling of like people just are really hungry for these kind of materials. And so part of it is just getting the word out that, you know, that they're here, and that, you know, and ways to use them. And I did a website, it's rosaparksbiography.org, for teachers to help with that as well. So I don't know, I'm also feeling in some ways very optimistic about the potential for kind of changing the curriculum. So
absolutely. And we have to leave it there, but thank you so much. This was such a fabulous discussion. Doctors Daina Ramey Berry, Callie Nicole Gross, Dr. Jeanne Theoharis, amazing books. Please pick up your copies of A Black Women's History of the United States, of the Rebellious Life History of Mrs. Rosa Parks, the Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, Young Readers Edition. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to those of you who donated through Eventbrite. And if you want to support the work of the Schomburg Education Department, please do so at schomburgcenter.org/support education. Stay safe, everyone, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.
All right. Bye, folks. Thank you. It was great speaking with you. Thanks so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
You.
Bye, Jeanne.